Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this side event. I appreciate this was an event that was only put into the calendar just recently, so you may have only become aware of it in the last week, but great to have you participating. I think it's towards the end of your day, so hopefully we give you an interesting and informative session for today. Hopefully everyone can see my screen that I've shared. So welcome once again. Just to give a little introduction, my name's Darren Waterman. I'm the Regional Director for Oil Spill Response Limited, covering Asia Pacific operations. And my colleague presenting with me today is James Tan, our Engagement Lead for Regional Activity as well. So this session is an hour long. We're going to give some information throughout the session, and there will be opportunities where we pose some questions to you, the participants. And as was mentioned there in the introduction, we're keen to have, and we'll look at those throughout and maybe discuss some of the feedback to the questions, but also it'll be useful for us to take away that information and see how we can better support the Pacific Islands and island territories in their continued endeavour for oil spill preparedness and response. So this morning's session, we're going to give a bit of an overview of OSRL and its capability, just in case any participants aren't familiar with us. Then we're going to talk a bit about the risks and impacts of spills, not just oil spills, but broader spills, mainly from the marine shipping industry. We're going to look at best practice when it comes, or should I say, good practice when it comes to oil spill preparedness and response, and what that looks like, what the components of best practice are, and how we would approach that activity to endeavour to have a good oil spill preparedness capability. We're going to talk a little bit about the framework that exists between OSRL and SPREP to allow Pacific Island countries and island territories access to global Tier 3 capability. And then really we'll wrap up at the end again with a final question just to get some feedback from the participants. On the last slide of today, we will provide a QR code where we're very keen to get your feedback on the session and also within that feedback form, you'll also have access to the questions that we asked. So if you feel like answering them after the session, you can do that in the feedback form at the end. So first of all then, a little introduction to oil spill response, as I said, just in case anyone isn't familiar with the organisation, and it helps set the scene and the capability that the islands have access to. So I think it's important to note that we are an industry-funded cooperative, so we're not a commercial organisation. We really exist to provide resources for our members to prepare for and respond to oil spills effectively and efficiently anywhere in the world. And our members consist of all businesses through the oil supply chain, including governments, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. An important aspect of being a cooperative is the resources are equally shared amongst all members. So it doesn't matter the scale or size of the members, they all have access to the same capability, and that's that international response for oil spills anywhere in the world, whether that be onshore, offshore, or on the shoreline. We're primarily owned by major oil and production companies, but as I said, our membership is much broader and covers the whole supply chain and governments. And of course, a key aspect of being able to respond is we support our members with those preparedness activities, and that could be technical advice, it could be training, it could be helping develop response plans and management plans. So we're situated throughout the globe. We're not a huge organisation, less than 300 people, but our primary base for providing resources across Asia Pacific is based in Singapore, with a representative office in Perth, where we have a small team of our experts located there, close to many of our members. We provide both surface response and subsea well capping services, but today what we're going to primarily talk about is that surface response capability, really linked to the risks around the marine shipping industry. So we have that response base in Singapore, where we have that surface response equipment and the specialist people. But resources can be cascaded in from any of our bases right across the globe to wherever they're needed when members call us out. And really our history spans well over 35 years. We have been responding to hundreds of oil spills in that time. And you'll see some of the key ones on the screen there, some of the major events, whether major in scale or impact, or how they maybe changed legislation. And oil spills, luckily, have reduced over time. But of course, we still experience that. Everyone's still very well aware that oil is going to be with us for a great number of years yet. And therefore, as a responsible industry and responsible parties, we all still need to be prepared for responding to those incidents when they do happen. And they do continue to happen, unfortunately. And it's important that we're ready and able to respond. So yeah, some key events that have happened there before. Some of the more recent ones, the Rena and the Hebe Spirit, regional shipping incidents there that I'm sure you'll be familiar with. The Rena, not a huge oil spill, but of course it had quite broad impacts. And some other ones such as the Prestige and the Erica that happened in Europe, pretty large oil spills, and they did change some approaches. So they changed some of the funder mechanisms. So oil spills, when they happen, they don't just have impact to the environment, to society, but they can change legislation as well. But I think the key point also is that we continue to evolve to be able to prepare for that changing risk. So these days we are expanding capability to help support responses for hazardous and noxious substances, for wildlife impacts, not just dealing with the oil, but how it affects wildlife, and for dealing for some other aspects which we'll talk about today, such as plastics. But really what members get access to is that specialist equipment integrate with other members' capability. So whether that's a government, a ship owner, or an oil company, we're there to supplement and support and provide that capability that really supports that tiered response philosophy and hopefully provides good outcomes in the event of an incident should it happen. Equipment really is a key aspect, of course, of being able to respond. You need specialist equipment, which could be all sorts of the things we're familiar with, booms and skimmers, or specialist aircraft for spraying dispersants over wide areas. But I think the differentiator is the expertise that comes and underpins that. So whether that's expertise that can do oil spill modeling, shoreline assessment technique, looking at environmental impacts and helping to determine the correct response strategies that cause the minimum impact to the environment, that's what the expertise is there to provide. So it's really important that we have that holistic capability in terms of the specialist equipment, but really underpinned by that expertise that can provide that advice and guidance and work with the member to really provide those better outcomes for the response. I won't dwell on this side, but these are the companies that own OSRL. There's an additional 120 associate members that really cover that whole oil supply chain, and the members collectively account for 2/3 of global oil production. But importantly, there's an increasing number of governments that see the value in joining OSRL. It's a cooperative mechanism that provides a pool of resources. They see the value of joining that to really underpin their national response capability. So it's not in place of, it just supplements that national capability. And I'm not talking about national oil companies here, because they would join through the traditional membership arrangements, but governments that don't specifically have their own risk. So they're not operating oil platforms or vessels. This is national interest. Should an incident happen that affects their national interest, it could be from a passing ship, it could be from a ship where the mechanism to get funding for response isn't sufficient enough, or it could be someone that doesn't maybe have sufficient insurance or capability, and the government needs to step in, or what we call a ghost spill. So spills, unfortunately, that happen from passing ships where they're unattributable, and therefore governments need to step in. So we're here to supplement that capability. And when I spoke to members of Pacific Islands and Island territories a year ago. Since then, we've already seen some additions to this list. The UK Coast Guard has joined, and the government of the Cayman Islands. Papua New Guinea joined just about a year ago independently. So there's a growing number of governments that see that value of accessing that shared capability to supplement their national capability. And of course, a year ago, after many years of work with the tripartite, so it was SPREP, it was OSRL, and it was the New Zealand government, we came up with a framework arrangement to allow Pacific Island countries and island territories with a mechanism to get access to these resources, but it was effectively funded by the New Zealand government. And then a mechanism allows that to happen. That framework has been in place for a year. And of course, that gives access to those resources in the event of an emergency. The key point is the countries and territories do need to accede to the agreement to really enable that mechanism to happen. And it's been in place for a year, but only Niue has actually acceded to that today. So only Niue does have that emergency access that's available. But the framework is there and available for all parties should they wish to exceed it, that would then allow them to have access. So a bit of a quick run through there in that initial stages, but I think the other things we're going to talk through this morning are probably more important. But what I would like to do now is really put a couple of questions to the participants, and please, this is an opportunity to put your thoughts within the chat. So the first one is, are the Pacific Island countries and island territories aware of, prior to what I've just said, and familiar with the framework for emergency access to Tier 3 response? So that would help us understand whether we need to do more work to help promote and make everyone aware of that. So we're keen to understand your thoughts. And secondly, it's interesting that only Niue has signed up to what is effectively a free access to guaranteed arrangements for Tier 3 response. So therefore, we're very interested to understand what is the barrier that's preventing other islands and island territories from acceding to the agreement. So what do we need to do different that allows you to have the access to the capability that is freely available? And as we know, in the event of a significant incident, you would need that international Tier 3 response support. So please put your thoughts in the chat and your answers there. And maybe if we get an opportunity, we'll pick up on those as we go through the session. So thanks for that initial session. Now I will move on a little bit more to talk about risks and impacts. We're of course very aware that the number of spills, and this particular graph is tanker-related incidents, has been reducing over time, which is a very enhances in navigation, enhances in training, enhances in the construction of ships and in regulation. And these are all very positive things. And we're seeing that reduction in the number of spills. But of course, there are other things. So we are seeing increased frequency of weather events and increased force in those weather events with more energy, which is likely to cause more shipping incidents. Unfortunately, many ecosystems are becoming less resilient. So spills can cause more of an impact because they're already less resilient, whether that's to do with climate change or other pollution. There is definitely a sustained prediction of long-term growth in chemical production and its global shipment. So, we've seen a number of chemical spills over recent years, whether that comes from chemicals in bulk from tankers or whether it comes from chemicals in packages. And that amount of chemicals is going to increase. So we need to be aware of that risk. In aligned with that, plastic feedstock. Our use of plastics continues to grow, and more of that feedstock is moved by shipping. And again, there is that risk of marine pollution. And also with the introduction of IMO 2020, a really positive step in the low sulfur fuel oils, but that does actually give challenges for responding to marine fuel oil incidences, because these oils have a greater range in how they behave and weather in the marine environment, and need different approaches for different oils. And of course, container vessels are growing in size, but also the size of the fleets continues to grow, and it's expected that will be a 6.5% growth year on year in the next 5 years. So increased number of ships we're going to see. So of course we need to be prepared. And oil spills do happen, no matter how prepared we are, unfortunately, they do happen. And I'm sure everyone here is very familiar, unfortunately, with the Solomon Trader event. And that was a grounding incident that released fuel oil into sensitive environment. Similar scenario with the MV Wakashiro that happened in the Indian Ocean. Again, a grounding that caused the release of fuel oil. So the causes of those events were slightly different, but the scenarios were quite similar. So these are the kind of events that we need to be prepared for. And of course, pretty much unanimously, when we work with many organizations that have oil spills, and they always say after a large or significant oil spill, they wish they were better prepared. And that's the key. You know, we can never be really as prepared as we want to be. It's about always having this journey of trying to improve and increase our level of preparedness. And some other tanker Symphony. This is actually carrying bitumen mix. This was in a collision in China, which have caused this very viscous product to leak into the marine environment. And a slightly different shipping incident, the Express Pearl, which was a fire on a container vessel. And I spoke to many people in the marine industry, and there is quite a concern in recent years that they're not seeing a downturn in the number of fires that are happening on container vessels. And this particular one was caused by the leaking of chemicals, which ignited a fire. Unfortunately, it ended up in the loss of the whole ship, and it had those chemicals carried in packages on board, as well as the fuel oil, as well as a large quantity of plastic feedstock, which leaked into the marine environment. So these are all the kind of different things that have happened in the last couple of years, but make up the mix of scenarios that, of course, we need to be prepared for. And chemical spills, oil, of course, is our biggest risk when we talk about marine spillage from shipping industry. But there is this increase in the use of chemicals and the increase in its shipment globally. Therefore, we do need to be prepared for dealing with chemical spills. And they affect in a very different way. They have a much greater range of behaviors when they're spilt into the marine environment. Traditional oils really follow this kind of category of either just purely a floater evaporators or dissolvers. And then occasionally you get some very heavy oils, heavy fuel oils that may sink. But chemicals are much more complex, and when they spill into the marine environment, they instantly behave in a wider range. They have probably a wider range of health and safety risks, but also the reactivity that we need to think about. So when the chemical spills into the marine environment, it may dissolve, but it may also react with the seawater and let off a different substance as part of that reaction, or react with the deck of the ship. So chemical response is much more complex. Luckily, it doesn't happen as often. Luckily, it doesn't happen in the same volumes. But again, it's just something that we need to be aware of and ready to be able to respond to when we're planning for our marine hazards. And the last one I want to talk about also, again, it doesn't happen in anywhere near the same quantities of oil, but we are seeing a growing amount of plastic. Now, we're all very familiar with the plastic that gets washed up in the shoreline, and that comes from all different places in terms of, you know, along the supply chain and waste disposal. But specifically here, I'm talking about plastics that's spilt from marine stock, the little plastic nurdles, small pellets, sometimes get spilt, whether that's a container that's lost, whether that's a collision between vessels, or with the previous scenario that I showed there, the Express Pearl that caught fire. And these plastic pellets are spilt in very large quantities in a small location into the marine environment. And therefore, they also need a response to be able to be mounted to deal with them effectively. And we don't always think about having an effective response for dealing with plastics. And here's just, if anyone's not familiar, a picture, these tiny little plastic pellets. They're only a few millimeters across, and they're really used as the raw material in pretty much all plastic production. And this is how they're shipped and transported around the world. Unfortunately, other environmental pollutants do adhere to the plastics. So not just the plastic itself that could be consumed by marine animals, but the pollutants that are in the water concentrate around the surface of the plastics, because we use plastic substances as absorbents for cleaning up oil. So that happens to these plastic pellets that also attract these marine pollutants, and they become more poisonous to the animals that feed on them, unfortunately, as well as clogging up their digestive system. So when these spills of these nurdles happen, we do need to be able to respond. And luckily, some of the response techniques are very similar for actually dealing with oil on a shoreline. And I've got some examples here of, this is a picture of nurdles on a shoreline. You can see pretty serious gross contamination that's caused by a shipping incident where a large quantity of these nurdles were spilt offshore, and the tide has brought this in. And just like oil, it gets washed into the vegetation. So that could be in the mangroves, that could be in the vegetation on the back shore, and just like oil, through the natural accretion and erosion that happens on a sandy shore through different stages of the year, it can get buried within the sand, and therefore you have to not only think about how to remove the plastic pellets from the surface, but there can be buried pellets in the same way that we can have buried oil. So I'm just setting the scene to different risks that we need to think about. It's not just oil, but also chemicals and plastics are things that pose risks from the shipping industry. And of course, what are the impacts? Well, pretty obviously, it's the ecological and environmental side. We're very aware of how oils can affect certainly sensitive areas like our coral reefs and our mangroves. But the plastics do as well, which we're very familiar with, and so do chemical spills. Chemical spills, depending on how they react, whether they float or they evaporate, really determines response, or whether it's really more of a monitor, evaluate, and work to reduce the impacts rather than trying to clean it up. And of course, there's socioeconomic impacts. Subsistence fishery, or whether it's more larger scale economy, then of course fishing is something that's impacted, as well as tourism and many other factors of the economy. So these things can be quite immediate when they happen, but they can also last a number of years afterwards, depending on the scenario, depending how well the response went through it. And of course, cultural impacts. We think about that last, but that's really something we also need to consider. So the key is we don't want oil spills to happen. The industry does spend a lot of time to prevent oil spills, but unfortunately they do happen, as does plastic and chemical spills, and they will affect everything from the environment to the economy. And therefore having an appropriate response ready to deal with it is really important. And James will be talking more in a minute on what that good practice looks like and give a little bit of an example of a scenario. So I'm just going to pause again there, and another question that I'd like to pose to the participants is what is your greatest concern in terms of marine pollution caused by shipping incidents and the oil industry activity in the Pacific Islands and island territories? So what is your main concern? We'd be keen to understand more about that. And secondly, are you satisfied with the current level of response preparedness? So if you're not, it'd be great to understand where you believe there are gaps. So that helps to focus our efforts, your efforts and our efforts, into how we can help close those gaps and help improve that level of response, because there is always gaps when we look deep enough, and we're always trying to evolve and improve our level of capability. So yeah, what's your greatest level of concern? And are you satisfied with the current level of preparedness? And are you able to identify any particular areas of gaps that you think need to be closed? Okay, so I'm sharing the screen, so I'm unable to see the chat, but at this stage, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, James, who's going to take us through the next session, which is about being ready for an incident, that good practice in response. So thank you, James.
Thank you, Darren. I think before we start out my session, I think there's a comment in the chat box that mentions that understand P&G is the other signatory to the OSRL membership. Perhaps I think we have a bit of time to make a clarification on that.
Yes, so that's a good question. Actually, the framework was available for in the map there. P&G has actually got its own independent membership directly with OSRL. So framework was available to Papua New Guinea, but it does have its own independent membership that it got about a year ago, I believe. I don't have the exact date. So yeah, P&G is a member of OSRL, but it's not through the framework agreement. It's an independent membership directly with OSRL. So thanks for that question.
And I think that there was a gentleman, I'm not so sure if a gentleman or lady who raised his hand, Coloni, if I got Cologne. Sir, ma'am, if I may ask you to unmute and raise your question. All right, perhaps she's, he or she is not yet ready. So no worries, I think we can, if we have some time after my session, I think we can address the questions if you have any. Just reading through the chat, okay. Thank you, Darren, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time for this session. Before I begin, I'll just probably share my screen. Please give me a moment. Okay, just to be sure that my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, James.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much, Darren. And perhaps a quick introduction of myself again. My name is James, James Tan. I am the industry engagement lead for the Asia Pacific region, like what Darren has introduced. I've been with OSRL for 9 years, and in this session down here, I hope to share some of the good practices we have, the industry have developed to respond to and prepare for an incident. So a quick recap of what Darren has talked about. I think some of the key takeaways that we can have is really the average number of spills are going lower, but they continue to occur. So Darren has also in his presentation quoted some of the examples of recent spills. And the risk profile changes with increasing ship traffic, bigger ships, more complex pollutants such as HNS and plastics. So though these changing risk profiles affects can potentially cause impacts to the environmental, ecological, socioeconomic, and cultural aspects of the economy. So I guess it is really prudent and responsible in certain sense to believe that an oil spill will take place near your location sometime. And when that happens, I guess the key questions that we want to ask ourselves is really, are you ready for an incident? So basically, I think an incident can really take place due to various reasons. And as we can see from some of the examples that Darren has quoted, some can take place because of grounding, spill can occur because of collisions, hull failure, fire explosions, which is one of the key hot topics, I think, within the industry. And I think the main unique feature about shipping risk is we are not able to predict when or where they will take place. And definitely in some cases, spill may not take place because depending on the severity, spills may not, the oil may not be spilled on the water, but when it does, I think what we don't really want to depend on luck, and you want to be prepared by ensuring that there's guaranteed access to resource and capabilities when we really need it. So to be prepared for the incident, I think we look at it from a perspective of how an ideal response will look like. So with that, I will use this cone of response model that you would see on your screen right now. So let me just bring up my laser pointer. So you see the source control here. It's on the diagram, it is a subsea well incident, but we can easily replace it with a collision incident that might take place. So for this session, let's just assume that this is a collision incident. So once there is a collision incident and spill unfortunately gets onto the water, there's a couple of processes that takes place, and I think it's good to understand what happens to the oil. We try to understand what we are dealing with and what are the response strategies that can be taken to mitigate the impacts to the sensitivities. So if you look at the bottom left corner here, when this oil is spilled, the oil itself goes through a couple of chemical and physical processes which alters the characteristics of the oil. So when the oil is spilled, it spreads on the surface depending on the viscosity. So that causes the oil to expand in area, and when it's on the sea surface, it evaporates. So all the lighter ends gets evaporated out, and what you get on the sea surface is something that's thicker, that's probably more difficult to remove, and something that's more persistent. Besides that, emulsification takes place. So emulsification is a process where the water gets into the oil and it creates a water in oil emulsion, a product that can expand to few times its original volume, and that increases the amount of waste, oily waste that we have to deal with. And apart from that, the oil is subjected to the heat, the wind, the wave actions that causes it to disperse sometimes into the water. And luckily, what we have in nature is that when this oil gets dispersed into the water column, the natural bacteria within the water column do help in the biodegradation of these oils. And what most of the time we will try to do is to make use of these natural processes to help allow the oil to degrade naturally. So that's a quick outlook of what happens to the oil. So in summary, when oil comes out from the vessel, it is fresh. It is something that is easy to deal with. But as it gets onto the surface and it moves towards the shoreline, what happens is that the characteristics changes, and that sometimes make it quite complex to respond, because the different changes in physical and or chemical characteristics do require a different sort of strategies. So that's why we have in oil spill response, we have more than a couple of strategies that we have in our pockets, and we do always advise stakeholders to keep them open and flexible, so that when you need it, we can mobilize it and use it. So I'll go within this model. Also, of course, this is not something that covers all the capabilities, but we'll try to highlight a few of them over here. So imagine when the oil gets under the water and it's still fresh. So obviously, if there could be some dangers of volatile organic components within that might be emitted, and that actually poses a health impacts to our responders. So what we will do over here, we would normally have exclusion zones so that our responders will be kept safe. And further away from it, there's a couple of strategies that we can take. If it's still concentrated in bulk, it's not spread to a very large extent, we can actually use containment and recovery, which mainly composes of two vessels pulling a boom, trying to contain and keep oil within the boom such that it can be recovered by the skimmers. So after that, as the oil moves towards, that's in zone A. So after that, when the oil moves towards zone B, you will imagine the oil starts to spread out across a larger area. Sometimes I think the size of a few football fields, depending on the characteristics of the oil. That's where you need to employ aerial dispersant that enables us to cover a large area of dispersants across within a short time, and you apply dispersants on that to facilitate the natural dispersion process. So a little bit on dispersants down here without getting too technical. The role of dispersants is really mainly to break this oil on the surface into smaller droplets by reducing the surface tension between the oil and water. So with that, it enables them to get to disperse into the water column in small droplets, and that actually facilitates the natural biodegradation process. So apart from that, of course, in order to manage this grand operation down here, you would need help from the satellite imagery and aerial surveillance. So having eyes in the sky is something that is very crucial and critical when it comes to response. So that gives you a good idea of what the scale of this response is like. And at the same time, while the oil is still on the water, you would be starting to prepare on the surface over here. Starting to think about what are your critical assets, your sensitivities near the shoreline. What do you really need to protect from the oil in order to prevent and mitigate the damage from there? So I hope this diagram down here does give you a good sense of the scale of the response over that might take place. And this is again an ideal textbook scenario. And of course, we would what Darren and I are here is really to raise awareness and promote to work towards this ideal scenario as much as possible. So I mentioned that there are a couple of capabilities that was talked about in the cone of response model, and the full suite of response capability are actually consolidated within this tiered preparedness and response concept, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen. It's represented in the wheel format. So zooming in on this view, so you will be able to see certain capabilities that we talked about just now. So at sea containment recovery is one of them. We have shoreline cleanup, shoreline protection of sensitive resources. We also have at sea containment and recovery, which mainly is operated by 2 vessels pulling a boom and some skimmers. Likewise, this view here really is a good practice planning approach adopted by the industry. We recognize that it is very difficult and not as ideal to own the full suite of capabilities. So with this tiered approach, it offers much more flexibility. If you compare, or some of you may be familiar with the concentric model in the past. So what this enables you to look at each capability in detail and decide really what do you need out of these 15, and of course these 15 response capabilities, and of course where they come from, which I will talk a bit more about that later on. So it consists of 15 response capabilities. If you count on your screen, it should have there is 15 response capabilities, 15 wedges, and with the incident management system sitting on the top, with the incident management system sitting in the middle. And this I would say, like to point out that for all, it's not required to have all the capabilities available, and the capabilities that you need should be tailored to the scenario that you have when you embark on the planning process. So diving deeper into the TPR view, we have the model, which I briefly talked about later just now, and the model consists of the wedge, which represents a capability. So I've quoted some examples earlier: at sea containment recovery, it could be aerial dispersants, etc. And with the incident management system sitting at the center of the wheel. So I think there's a symbolic significance to why the incident management system sits in the middle, because of the central role that it plays in coordinating resources to effectively execute this response capability. So if you can see the incident management system, it is a structured approach responding towards an incident, and you can actually break them down by functions. So at the top, we have the command function, which is supported by a few sections such as the operations, planning, logistics, and finance. So in this session, I wouldn't go too deep into the incident command system due to a lack of time, but I'll be happy to talk about it in future sessions. So by now you have seen or recognized that there are a few colors within the wedge, and each color represents a different tier level. The tier level represents where response capability comes from. So the dark blue represents tier 1, green represents tier 2, and the slightly lighter shade of blue represents tier 3. And how I would visualize it is that the total response capability is equals to what you have for tier 1 plus what you have for tier 2 plus what you have for tier 3. So that's how you would visualize it, and it could be very different from different scenarios. So your scenario over here will be slightly different from the operator who is operating in a more complex location. So I think that's something that we have to recognize at this point of time. So earlier on, I've talked about the role of incident command system or incident management system to coordinate resources. And we understand that at this point of time, resources do come from different tiers. And we want to provide some definition to it so that you can probably put it better in context in terms of and visualize it. So when we define resources, it's mainly responders, and responders are really skilled personnel. So they can be spill response specialists who is trained for the job. So for OSRL, our responders are trained when they first join. They are trained in the 3-month program to make sure that they get the basics right, and after which there's a 5-year program that brings them from a spill response specialist all the way to a senior specialist. And next we have equipment such as vessels, booms, skimmers, which we've talked about. And they can be highly specialized, such as the aerial dispersants platform that OSRL has. And of course, there's also additional support when it comes to managing the spill. So this additional support can be in the form of oil spill trajectory modeling. So at the start, you would you would utilize the oil spill trajectory modeling to understand where the oil is heading, and then you make plans according to that trajectories. And of course, other additional support we might have is a network of experts. So Darren mentioned earlier on, there are a couple of different impacts from the oil spill. So OSRL do maintain that level of a network of wildlife experts, for example, to manage any incidents relating to wildlife. And in terms of tiers, we classify them by tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and they are mainly based on the proximity to the spill location. So when you look at how we understand tier 1 is that they provide the initial resources necessary to handle the local spill. So this can be equipment and responders held at a local facility like a refinery terminal, a storage terminal, a port, and the size of this tier 1 can actually vary quite a lot. So there's no standard way of defining a tier 1. There is a couple of ways to do it. In certain countries, they are managed by legislation. So in certain regulations, the port are required to maintain a certain level, a minimum level of stockpile of equipment. But I would say that mainly this, if tier 1, if you do not have enough access to tier 2 or tier 3, you will probably need to look at having a very robust level of tier 1 equipment and capability to respond to an oil spill incident. So for tier 2, these are supplementary resources from the national or regional level. The organizations of these tier 2 resources can be manifest in different forms, such as mutual aid arrangements between the operators. I think this we have seen in Australia. So in Australia, there's a mutual aid arrangement between the operators. There's also industry-funded oil spill cooperatives, such as one we see in Thailand and in Malaysia. So these are funded by the oil companies within the nation, within the country, and they operate as a separate entity from these companies. And next, we have private service providers, and also government-led entities, which is equipped with the substantial response capabilities, such as the Coast Guards. So an example of which, we've seen the Indian Coast Guards having a very substantial tier 2 level of response capability, likewise in Philippines as well. And for tier 3, I think it's the additional resources that comes in globally. So the key thing here is globally to support response, and actually due to the unique structure of tier 3 is usually industry owned. For example, OSRL is the tier 3, is the largest tier 3 industry owned cooperative. So we are owned by the industry, and that gives us the flexibility to own a broader spectrum of response capability, such as the aerial dispersion platform, and in a very highly cost-effective manner. So after understanding the TPR concept and how it works, I'll probably provide a case study from Rayong, Thailand. This incident took place in July 2013, and it is caused during a crude oil transfer operation at Single Point Marine. So at this point of time, of course, I think we recognize that the source of the spill can be quite different. So it can be either a collision, and it can be either on the from the transfer operations here. But I think the key point is to illustrate how the different tiers work together. And during the transfer operation, there was a rupture in the 16-inch diameter pipeline, resulting in a spill of roughly 50,000 liters of crude oil. So what happened was that the transfer operation stopped immediately. I think that was the first initial response, which limited the amount of oil on water. And the pipeline valve was actually shut off to prevent further leakage into the waters. So the exact point of spill is somewhere along here. Just want to make sure, to make sure that this is not the real picture. I took this picture of for illustration only. So very soon after the incident, so the client contacted OSRL, and we conducted a oil spill trajectory modeling for them, and the spilled slick or oil slick is sort of projected to head towards Koh Samet, which is a very famous tourist location and very popular among the locals and tourists, overseas tourists. So immediately what happened was that the tier 1 and tier 2 response was initiated. So what then was mobilized was the aerial surveillance via helicopter. This was mobilized by the 1st Naval Command of the Thai Navy, because the Thai Navy was this area command was responsible for the northern part of the Gulf of Thailand, and the industry provided their support as well in the form of vessel dispersion application, providing the vessels and the necessary dispersion platform to apply dispersants on the water, and of course at sea containment and recovery to try to contain the spill, because the spill has not yet spread too big, and it was prompt and it was suitable at that point of time to contain the spill. But what happened was that due to strong winds and weather elements, it was the southwest monsoon at that point of time. The boom did not work as planned, and so the oil continued to move towards Koh Samet, and it was quite dangerous. And that was when OSRL came in with the Oculus C-130. So what we did was to fly from Singapore to the Utapao Airport at the location and conducted an aerial dispersion operations. Of course, before we did that, we have to ascertain that the dispersants were still working well. So we did 2 runs of the spill. The first run of the spill was a test run to ascertain that the dispersants were still working well on the spilled oil slick. And after that was confirmed, we would dispense the rest of the dispersants on board, and we managed to clear out most of the oil spill, or most of the spilled oil. But inevitably, because due to the limitations of the resources down there, oil still managed to hit the Koh Samet Koh Samet Island, specifically the Alprau Beach. So Alprau Beach was one of the most popular beach on Koh Samet. And in this area down in this diagram picture at the top right corner, so you will see that most of the oil is actually concentrated at the bay, northern part of the bay, and it spread across this the whole bay down here. And this was the picture that was taken from the respondent's perspective, and you will see how thick the oil is and how much the oil is actually. So this is despite what the response efforts that was taken, and I think this was a sort of a lowest, the best mitigation effort that could have been done at that point of time. So subsequently, there were some cleanup operations, which I wouldn't go into details at this point of time. I understand we don't have a lot of time at this point of time. But I would say that in a quick glance, the aftermath of this incident, we mobilized one C-130 Hercules from Singapore. So there were more than 10 vessels involved at the SC operations at any point of time. The involvement of more than 28 government and private organizations. So at its peak, I think there were close to more than 2,000 personnel, crews, and volunteers mobilized for the shoreline cleanup. So this would be the picture over here is something that you will see them doing manual handling to scoop up the oils and putting it onto the IBC tanks down here. This was due to the limitation that there wasn't a lot of oil spill response equipment at that point of time, but there were a lot of manpower. So we had to adapt to the resources that we had at that point of time. The response and cleanup operations took 11 days with 2,000 manpower just to clean up and respond to the incident. And eventually the cost accumulated to $30 million USD in response and compensation. And I think I would like to focus on the aftermath of the impacts, that it took 3 years of restoration and monitoring works, including 40 projects to restore tourism and promote Koh Samet. So there was a lot of questions on the food safety and whether the beaches were as pristine as back then. So there were a lot of work, a lot of projects to restore the confidence to encourage tourists back to Koh Samet. 31 projects to support education, jobs, and jobs creation. So without the tourism, which was the main economic activity back then, so it had a widespread impact on the wider economy, such as education, jobs creation, etc. So there were projects there to support the welfare and the well-being of these communities residing there. And of course, 13 projects to support the restoration of marine environment. This was conducted in collaboration with the relevant government agencies such as Fisheries, Department of Fisheries, Department of Environment, to monitor the coral reefs, the health of the coral reefs. So this was the aftermath of what happened for that incident. And I hope with what I've shared, I've managed to convince you on the potentially catastrophic impacts of an oil spill incident. Of course, I think every situation is different, but I think if we would definitely want to mitigate the impact as much as possible. And at this point of time, I think you'll be on your mind, how do we get prepared for an oil spill then? The focus of this presentation is not on preparing, but of course, if I can share with you more, I can spend an hour or so just to talk about how do we get effectively prepared to an oil spill. But I would like to leave the 4 most important critical elements of an oil spill in this presentation, which is competent personnel, a well-developed plans, regular exercises, and adequate resource. So these are the 4 critical elements that I would say really makes up an effective response. And the level or the degree of how well you have to be prepared obviously depends on how much risk do you have and what's the scenario like. So with this, I think I would encourage all of you to look at your risks and really back to what Darren's fourth questions was, how are you satisfied with the level of your preparedness? And I think I'll probably like to raise it, and that is with respect to your risks. So how do you view your risk right now, and how prepared do you think you are at this point of time? So with that, I think I end my presentation. I think I will pass the mic back to Darren.
Thank you, James. And as James mentioned, we'd love to have a longer opportunity to talk in more detail what that good practice looks like, because there's really a number of key components to that. But the overview there, which James provided, hopefully provides a good bit of information. Next slide, please, James.
Sorry, Darren, give me a moment.
Sure. So we're really just about, I appreciate we're on the hour pretty much now, so we're just going to have one sort of final slide to kind of wrap up with a final question, and we're interested to get that final bit of input and feedback back from yourself. So as James just mentioned, really the four key components of being ready is about having those well-developed plans. And of course, you have your national plan. There's the PAC plan that talks about that support from between countries and from the metropolitan countries that are signed up to that plan. It's about having adequate resources, and resources is people and it's specialist equipment. And that's at both the tier 1 local level, tier 2 regional, and of course, tier 3, that's where we come in and support. That the people that are available are competent in their role. So when they do sit within an incident command structure, or they're a beach master looking after shoreline, that they're competent and can undertake that role. And of course, that we regularly exercise that capability. They're really the key components. And of course, there's a lot more to that that comes into preparedness, but they're the key components. So as we've mentioned throughout, prevention is obviously better than cure. Our role isn't prevention, it's very much about being prepared and response, but everyone's well aware the more we can do to prevent spills, the better it is. But spills do continue to happen, and of course we do need to be ready because they will impact us. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. I've been in the industry 20 years now, and I've seen enough oil spills and experience to know that it's going to happen again, and we all need to be prepared. Oil is still the dominant risk. We know oil is something that will dwindle away over time as we change, and our energy usage comes from different sources, but it's still very much going to be with us for a long time. However, it's not the only hazard from the marine industry. We do have to think about chemicals, and as I said, there's also other risks such as the plastic feedstock, pellets that could cause significant impacts to the environment or to the economy if it's spilt on the shoreline. Our role is really to help. That's what we're here for. We help both in terms of allowing everyone to be better prepared, but we're also available for that emergency support for our members. And we encourage more Pacific Island countries and territories to accede to the agreement because it's free, and then you get access to the resources. So I guess there's one final question, which is how can we further help you on your oil spill preparedness journey? So hopefully through that stimulate your thoughts on where you are and things that need to be done, then we're keen to understand how can we further help island countries and island territories on their continued preparedness journey. So your thoughts and feedback welcome in the chat.
Darren, I think we have a raised hand from a participant. Sir, ma'am, do you mind unmuting yourself? And perhaps if we can see you on video, that'd be great as well. Mr. or Miss Colon?
So you should be able to unmute yourself now if you can, if you want to raise a question.
It seems like he's having some technical difficulties, but I think perhaps we can go to the QR code, and that's another avenue for him to.
Sure. Well, if anyone wants to raise any questions, so we've got another opportunity. So thank you anyway for the time. We'd love to spend more time talking with you about oil spill preparedness and response. And if anyone wants to contact us, we'll be happy to spend time after this session with anyone. Our email addresses are up on the screen there. But as James mentioned, there's a QR code at the bottom of the screen. If you scan that with your mobile phone, there's a form there where you can provide us with some feedback, but also the same questions that we've asked throughout the presentation. We're keen to get your input and answers to those questions, which will help us further help you with your preparedness journey. So please do fill that out if you have some time. We've hoped this session has been informative, and don't hesitate to contact us afterwards if you want some more information or some one-to-one sessions with us. So thank you everyone for your time.